Okay, we're moving along to chapter 16. We're going to be talking about decision making in regards to organizational processes. In this chapter, we're going to be defining program decisions versus non-program decisions. We're going to describe the process of decision making. We're going to discuss major behavioral influences on the process of decision making. We're going to look at group decision making and individual decision making of effectiveness. And we're going to talk about some different methods managers can use to stimulate creativity in group decision making. Decision making is the quality of the decisions made by the manager, and it's the yardstick measuring a manager's effectiveness. This chapter analyzes decision making as a consequence of information people receive through the organizational structures, the behavior of people who are considered important in the organization, the behavior of the groups that are considered important. We have program decisions and non-program decisions. When we talk about program decisions, we're talking about specific procedures developed that are repetitive and routine. When we talk about non-program decisions, these are often unique, one-time decisions. They're complex and they tend to be more management problems. We can take a look at a comparison of the different types of decisions between programmed and non-programmed in terms of the problem, whether it's frequent or occasional, with the procedure that we use in terms of how we go about designing a decision process. And we have a couple of examples from business and government, whether we have a programmed or a non-programmed decision. When we are talking about decision making, it's a means to achieve some kind of result or solve some problems. Every type of decision is a result of a problem in the organization, and that is a process that's influenced by many forces. When we look at the decision process, it's not necessarily as linear as the one that we have in the book and in this particular slide, but it is important to note that along the way you keep making revisions and adapting it and kind of almost have a continuous loop of analysis. First, you need to establish different goals and objectives and results. You need to, and in doing so, then you identify problems that might come up in achieving those. You always look at developing multiple alternatives to solving problems, evaluating those, have methods for evaluating those alternatives. Then you're going to have to select one which is part of the decision making. And then the implementation is critical in the decision making. And then we always have the feedback of controlling and evaluating how effective our decision was. In terms of goals, objectives, and evaluations, they're needed whenever performance influences effectiveness. So what results are we going to be achieved? What measures show if those results have been achieved? And management needs to communicate their tolerance for experimenting and failing by subordinates. If we create an environment of no risk, then people aren't going to make decisions that might have some risky factors associated with it. As I said earlier, we need a necessary condition for a decision is having a problem. And in identifying the nature of the problem, they can be hindered by things that we talked about in our last chapter on communication, about having perceptual differences, or we might already be looking at solutions before we're even looking at the problem. And we also might be identifying some of the symptoms as problems, and that might be inaccurate. So before a decision is made, we need to look at how we can develop many different alternatives. And we should have multiple alternatives developed before we make a final decision, and we should know the consequences of each one of those alternatives. The amount of alternatives we develop might be dependent on how much time we have and how much cost. Sometimes simulations and modeling cost money or involve a lot of resources of people. Too few alternatives can wind up costing even more time and resources than too many, too. And lots of organizations tend to use scenario analysis so that they can look at best case, worst case, and no change type of situation. During these scenarios, many different possibilities of alternatives are uncovered. When we evaluate the alternatives, we want to look at the objective of our decision-making process, and we want to select an alternative that's going to produce the most favorable outcome. And when we're looking at these outcomes, we have different conditions. How much certainty is that the decision we make is going to be correct, how much uncertainty, and how much risk are we actually assuming in that process. An alternative is selected to solve a problem in order to achieve a predetermined objective, like we talked about a couple slides ago. An alternative rarely achieves the objective without having an impact on something else. So decisions don't stand alone. There's usually something that is involved within a decision. If nothing is impacted by it, it's probably not a very effective decision. The values of the decision maker strongly influence the alternative chosen, and we're going to talk about that later in our discussion here. The decision maker is often the satisfier rather than the optimizer. They want to make the best decision without often using too high of a risk factor. When one thing, we can have all sorts of alternatives developed, but any decision that's not implemented is basically an abstraction of ideas and situation. Implementation could be more important than the actual choice of the alternative and how that's implemented. We can have plans, but how we implement them is going to be key to the organizational effectiveness. Implementing decisions always involves people. Even a technically sound decision can be undermined by dissatisfied subordinates, and we need to make sure that the solutions are transformed into behaviors that are effective and long-lasting. With effective management usually involves periodic measurement. We always have control and evaluation. If we don't have a measurable objective, then we don't have any way to determine if our decision was effective and if we've achieved the performance that we want. Changes must be made in the solution chosen if we're not achieving performance, how we're implementing it, and maybe going back and taking a look at our initial objective. And once the decision is implemented, we shouldn't always assume that we're going to accomplish the outcome that we had. Sometimes trying to solve one problem creates another problem. Behavior influences decision making, and this could involve the ethics, the values, the personality, how adverse someone is to risk or how much they like risk, how much they might have a dissonance around, once they make a decision, and their commitment to it once they make a decision. Ethics is really important in helping individuals determine the difference between right and wrong. Unethical decisions lead to organizational distrust, conflict, and a much less productive work environment. When we have misconduct in the workplace and we have unethical behavior, what we see is lying, stealing, drug abuse, falsification of records, lots of conflicts of interest, and a misrepresentation to our supervisors of information that we have. Factors that might influence these ethical or unethical decisions have to do sometimes with gender, have to do with moral philosophies and religions, have to do with the level of education, how much work experience they have, how old they are, and maybe just their awareness capabilities. Factors that influence ethical decisions in the group. Usually we have sort of a peer influence that has a significant effect on others within the organization. Organizationally, we should have a culture and climate that has some direct influence over ethical decision making. Lots of organizations, as we said earlier in our studies here, have codes of ethics to try and raise employee awareness of ethical behavior. An organization that is classic for helping people make ethical decisions is Texas Instruments, and they often have people ask these questions before they make a decision. First of all, is this decision legal? And if it's not, then you don't do it. Does it comply with our values? That means knowing your values. If you do it, are you going to feel bad? If you make this decision and you feel bad about it, but you've hurt somebody or it was unethical or not in line with your values, that's not appropriate either. If it shows up in the newspaper, how are you going to feel? And they say, if you know it's wrong, then you don't do it. If you're not sure, then you ask. Keep asking until you get an answer. Those are really good questions to ask when you're having a value and ethical dilemma. Values have a profound impact in organizations on how objectives, alternatives, selection of the alternatives, implementation of these decisions that are made, and the control and evaluation. We have different variables affecting the decision-making process. We have personality variables, we have situational variables, and we have the interaction that happens when somebody's involved right in the scene and how they feel about that specific interaction in regards to their personality. Conclusions about the influence of personality on decision-making is one person is unlikely to be equally proficient in all aspects of decision-making process in terms of how they develop alternatives or implement them. But things like intelligence, they're linked with different phases of the decision-making process. The relationship of a person to the decision-making process can vary in groups, And the ambiguity of the decisions could also influence people's decisions about how easy it is to make that decision or how complicated. Things that we talked about earlier have to do with propensity for risk. If a decision maker has a low aversion to taking risks, they're going to make different objectives and make different decisions around their selection of the decisions. There's a fine line between making an arbitrary decision based on low aversion to risk or becoming so obsessed with numbers, analysis, report that you have such an aversion to risk that you don't make a decision. When you have a propensity for risk, the amount of the risk in a decision depends on answering some of these questions. Are the goals clear? Is information about the alternatives known in terms of when you do implement them, do you know what's going to happen? And have future outcomes associated with the alternatives been identified? So if we have some kind of a result from our, remember we said that decisions aren't made independently. If we know what impact that might have, it might be important. Here's a nice framework for classifying decisions along risk, low risk, and high risk along those questions about certainty and uncertainty. And you can see the outcomes of whether the possibility of failure occurs. If there's a lot of certainty, if your goals are established, as we said, the alternatives are there, and we know the impact on the alternatives on other type of decisions. Dissonance we talked about earlier under motivation and communication. It's like post-decision regret. It's post-decision anxiety. There's often this inconsistency between what the decision made and then how the person feels. And now the decision maker has doubts about or second thoughts about the decision that they made. This potential for dissonance is greater under when it's extremely important financially, when there's a number of other foregone alternatives, and when the foregone alternatives have really different favorable features, so it makes it hard for the choices. You can reduce dissonance by making sure you have good information, by perceiving the information that supports the decision, by not having actually having a less favorable view of some of the foregone alternatives that create that anxiety, and then minimizing negative aspects of the decision and focusing more on positive outcomes. The one thing we talk about is escalation of commitment. It's like once they're in and they've made a decision, they keep at it whether the decision makes any makes sense anymore or not. And it occurs when a decision maker wants to stay a course of action no matter what, even when confronted with negative information about the viability of their course of action. They're in it and they feel maybe it's almost a face-saving situation. Some of this is evolved around self-justification, where the decision maker escalates the commitment because they don't want to admit that they were wrong or they didn't properly allocate resources, and they really are embarrassed and they stay on that course no matter what. Self-monitoring and good feedback help reduce that cognitive dissonance and cognitive distortion. Moving on to kind of, we've been talking a little bit about individual decision making. We're going to look a little bit more at group decision making. This is becoming more common because more organizations are working in groups and teams. We have non-program decisions involving more uncertainty. There's more complexity, which requires more specialization in the knowledge, so it requires some of the knowledge of the team members. And decisions eventually have to be accepted by many units within the organization, so it helps to have group members on board. If we look at the differences between individual and groups are known to take longer to reach decisions, but they also require consensus, or they have majority votes, or they have leader decisions. They have different ways that they go about making those decisions. Some of the problems in group decisions have to do with some things like groupthink, where they have a pressure to conform. They don't want any outside assistance, and usually they are best results with non-program type of decisions. Again, establishing objectives. Groups are superior than individuals because they have more knowledge to pool. They have more ability because of their broad scope of resources to identify more alternatives, and also the consequences of some of those alternatives. They can collectively judge with the group some of the different viewpoints to make a more effective decision. Groups also interact and have consensus, and with that they tend to be willing to accept a higher level of risk, and a group decision is likely to be accepted when you have more participation of all those people as members of the groups and those that are affected by the consequences. However, when you do implement a decision, it is usually implemented by an individual manager or leader in the organization. If you take a look here at the relationship between the quality of the group decision and the method used, you can see that when we have a consensus, that the probability of the quality of the decision is higher. One of the things when we have groups is we'd like to have creative decision making, and here's a couple of different things that we're going to be talking about, of different approaches to having more creative group decision making, such as the nominal group technique, the Delphi process, and brainstorming. Some of you may have already been involved in some of these things. Brainstorming is a very simple approach where people just start throwing out ideas. You probably write them on a whiteboard or a computer. No idea is too ridiculous, nobody's judgmental, and no ideas to be criticized. And then you start to evaluate those ideas once everybody's kind of said what they had to say. On the Delphi process, that isn't usually face-to-face. Usually it involves experts. Sometimes it's anonymous. Sometimes it's through a questionnaire where people are asked their expertise. And usually what happens is this removes the bias of face-to-face interaction. And you have multiple judges that make some sort of recommendations about a decision. And also the nominal group technique, which is one that's very commonly used in organizations and group settings, is what you'll usually have is you'll ask people to write down their ideas for solving a problem. You give people time to do that. Then they start presenting their ideas one at a time. Again, kind of like the brainstorming, there's no judgment. You have somebody record the ideas, and then once they're out of them, they look at if they need to have a little discussion just for clarification. But then the group ranks the ideas in order of preference, and then the group decision is based on that ranking, and then there's probably discussion and elimination along that. It's a very effective tool for people who tend to be have a mix of extroverted and introverted people in their group. Here it's a comparison between the Delphi process and the nominal group technique, where nominal group people seem to get acquainted, they meet face to face, and they communicate directly with one another. And in the Delphi approach, they usually do it through questionnaires and may be distributed in many different locations and maybe even respond anonymously.